All right, today we're diving into an analysis of a commodity that, honestly, it just breaks all the rules. I mean, we're talking about a raw material where future demand isn't some wild guess. It's practically a known fact. When you think about commodities, you probably think of these wild, unpredictable price swings, right? But what if there was one that was completely different? One where the demand was so locked in, so certain that you could actually predict it 10 years from now with incredible accuracy. Sounds kind of crazy, I know, but this analysis says it's very, very real. And that commodity, it's uranium, the stuff that fuels nuclear power. And believe me, it plays by a totally different set of rules than anything else we dig up. So let's get into the most important rule of them all. Okay, so the entire thesis here really hinges on one single idea, that the demand for uranium is just incredibly stable and predictable. So let's unpack exactly why that is. I mean, just look at this contrast right here. Forecasters trying to predict oil and gas demand, they're often off by a mile. But with uranium, we're talking 90 to 95% accuracy years out. And the reason's pretty straightforward. Demand has nothing to do with whether the economy is booming or busting. And once you've built a nuclear reactor, there's absolutely no substitute for its fuel. This whole predictability thing really comes down to three key pillars. First, every single nuclear reactor out there has a fixed, known appetite for fuel. It's like knowing exactly how much a gas a car will burn per mile. Second, all the data is public. We know exactly how many reactors are running, being built, and scheduled to retire. And third, and this is a big one, a utility can't just decide to use less uranium to save money. If that reactor's on, it is burning a set amount of fuel. End of story. And a huge reason for that predictability is that nuclear reactors are the absolute workhorses of the electrical grid. We're talking running at 90 to 95% of their full power, 24/7, all year round. They provide what's called baseload power, the constant, steady electricity supply we all rely on. This means their fuel consumption is just relentless. It never stops. Okay, so this is really the crucial point. Just look at where the money goes in a nuclear plant. The actual uranium fuel, it's only about 5% of the total cost to run the place. The huge expenses are building it and maintaining it. So think about that. Even if the price of uranium doubles or even triples, the utility company has basically zero reason to shut down the reactor. It's just a tiny slice of their overall budget. All right, so we've established this incredibly predictable, rock-solid demand. Now let's flip the coin and look at the other side of the equation, supply. And this is where the story gets really interesting. Because the supply side is, well, it's the exact opposite of flexible. You can boil the whole problem down to some pretty simple math. Every single year, the world's reactors need around 185 million pounds of uranium. But all the world's mines combined, they only produce about 135 million pounds. That leaves this huge 50 million pound gap that has to be filled from somewhere. And this isn't some one-off problem. This is a permanent structural deficit year after year. And here is the absolute kicker. You can't just flip a switch and get more supply. It's not like drilling for oil. To bring a brand new uranium mine online, from the moment you find it to the day you get the first pound out of the ground, takes 10 to 15 years. Think about that. That incredible delay means the market is physically incapable of reacting quickly to fill that gap we just talked about. And if that wasn't enough, just look at where this stuff actually comes from. A single country, Kazakhstan, controls a mind-boggling 43% of all global production. When your supply is that concentrated in one place, you're introducing a massive amount of geopolitical risk for every single country that depends on nuclear energy. So let's recap. We've got this fixed, unshakable demand and a really squeezed, inflexible supply. But the story doesn't stop there. There are some huge global trends happening right now that are basically pouring gasoline on this fire, and they're about to accelerate demand even more. There are really three big forces at play here. First, decarbonization. Everybody wants carbon-free energy, and nuclear is pretty much the only game in town for 24/7 power that doesn't produce carbon. Second, energy security. The gas crisis in Europe was a huge wake-up call for nations to control their own energy destiny. And third, we're just seeing explosive growth in the number of reactors, especially over in Asia. And we are not talking about small, tiny changes here. To put this into perspective, just look at China. They're planning to nearly triple their fleet of reactors to over 150 by 2035. The ambition of just that one country is going to create a monumental surge in future demand for uranium. And it's not just China going it alone. At the big COP28 climate conference, more than 25 countries, we're talking the US, Japan, the UK, and others, all got together and publicly pledged to work on tripling the world's nuclear capacity by 2050. The political momentum here is it's undeniable.
Okay, but let's be real. Whenever you talk about nuclear power, there's always the elephant, or maybe the black swan in the room, right? What about the risk of another big accident? Well, the analysis doesn't shy away from this. It tackles it head on.
Look, Fukushima was the ultimate stress test for this entire idea. It was the absolute worst-case scenario. Japan shut down its entire fleet of reactors. Germany hit the panic button and accelerated its own phase-out. But look what happened next. A little over a decade later, Japan is firing its reactors back up, and globally, we now have more nuclear capacity online than we did before the accident ever happened. So here's the big takeaway from that. The analysis makes a powerful point. Even the most devastating nuclear accident you can imagine didn't kill the long-term demand. All it did was press pause. It delayed the inevitable for about 10 years before those fundamental drivers, decarbonization and energy security, roared back to life. And all of this creates what the analysis calls an asymmetric profile. What does that mean? It means the downside risk seems limited. You've got production costs that create a natural floor on the price, and you have buyers, the utilities, who have to buy no matter the cost. But the upside potential could be huge. We've seen prices way higher in the past, and new mines need a price of around $80 to $90 a pound just to make it worth their while to even start digging.
Okay, so we've gone through the predictable demand, the tight supply, the massive policy support, and even the resilience to a worst-case scenario. So let's pull it all together and talk about why this analysis says this whole situation is really coming to a head right now.
The immediate trigger here is this huge dilemma that utility companies are facing. See, for the past decade or so, they've been living easy, coasting on these super cheap, long-term contracts they signed when uranium prices were in the toilet. Well, guess what? Those contracts are expiring. Their backup inventories have been drained, and now they all have to rush back into the market at basically the same time to lock down fuel for the next decade.
And herein lies the problem. Even with the price hikes we've seen recently, today's price is just barely enough to convince anyone to build the new mines we need to solve that 50 million pound a year deficit. There is absolutely no slack in the system. None. And that, right there, is the core conclusion of this entire analysis. The argument is that the market has hit an inflection point. Prices simply have to go higher, and maybe a lot higher, to give miners the incentive they need to start producing all the fuel required to meet this guaranteed, non-negotiable global demand.
So this is pretty much where the analysis leaves us. The demand side of the equation, it's basically a solved problem. We know it's there, and we know it's growing. The final multi-billion-dollar question is all about the supply side. What's the price tag? At what price will the world finally get the uranium it so desperately needs?